All right, so you contacted us, and it seems like, you were pretty surprised by something you came across, and it had to do with, how Slovenia's administrative system may be possibly operating, on some potentially unlawful grounds. And this was obviously something that kind of caught you off guard, and we're going to do a deep dive on that today. I have our expert here who's going to help us understand. We're going to look into all the documents you shared with us, things about the municipality, also the National Independent Expert Council for Digital Ethics, they also call that NSDE, and then just like a whole bunch of other related materials that you sent our way.
Yeah, I think, what's so interesting about this right off the bat is just seeing how all of these things actually fit together, right? You've got what looks like almost like a draft, a proposed piece of legislation. They're calling it the Ethical Law on the Protection of Digital Privacy, or, e-ZVDZ. And then along with that, we've also got some documents, that outline how the NSDE, this ethics council was actually created, right? And what they're supposed to be doing. And then even beyond that, I mean, the whole broader context of just the discussions that are happening about data privacy in this day and age with everything going digital, especially connected services and even our cars, right? So I think our goal here is to really just, get into these Slovenian sources, kind of unpack them a little bit and see if we can figure out what exactly sparked this reaction in you.
Yeah.
And this feeling that maybe there were some systemic issues going on.
Yeah, exactly. And as we dig into these documents, you start to see these different areas that are, they keep popping up. They're causing a lot of anxiety. This idea of, everything becoming more and more digital. And what does that mean for control? Who has control? And then specifically worries about cars and how much they can actually watch us now and what data they're gathering. And then, of course, what is the role of this NSDE, this council that's supposed to be keeping an eye on all the ethics of it, and then, finally we have this e-ZVDZ, this proposed law, and all of the different things it's trying to put into place, especially in relation to GDPR and the Slovenian constitution. It's a lot.
It is. Let's maybe just jump right in with this whole digitalization and control thing, right? I mean, it seems to be a really core thread running through a lot of this, this e-ZVDZ thing that they're proposing. It uses some really strong language in there. At one point, they even talk about digital slavery under the guise of progress, which is pretty intense, right? And they go on to say that fraud, surveillance, and manipulation are richly financed. That's pretty direct.
Yeah, and that totally lines up with the concerns you had about how everything's going digital, right? We're getting rid of the old ways of doing things, and it's all about ID cards and digital currency and online banking, and the land registry is moving online, and you're wondering what's the real motivation behind all of this? And it seems like the document's kind of raising that same question too.
For sure. And if we kind of zoom out a little bit, the document also brings up this interesting point about how there hasn't really been a whole lot of public discussion about some of the really huge technological changes that are happening, right? I mean, they talk about the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of Things, all these medical sensors that are everywhere, and even things like, geoengineering and how we produce food. Pretty fundamental stuff. And it sounds like your concern about transparency is spot on here. Right? It's are all of these massive changes happening without people really knowing about them or having a chance to weigh in?
Totally. And, the document even gets into specifics. They mention, they give the example of Google DeepMind and how there are accusations that they were getting access to patient data, without actually having permission, which, is a big deal. And then they make this kind of alarming comparison, right? They talk about China and their social credit system, and they call it digital totalitarianism. And it doesn't let the West off the hook either. It points out things like the PRISM program and how basically there's this trend of data collection going on all over the world, right? And the potential for things to go very wrong, like to be used against people, in really scary ways.
Yeah, for sure. It all kind of boils down to this question of how do we find the right balance, right, between the convenience and the potential benefits of all this digital stuff and our basic rights to privacy and to just make our own choices, without being manipulated. And I think this document, it's saying that, we need to be really careful because all of this data collection, if it's not controlled, it could gradually lead to us losing some of those freedoms, like we could little by little lose the ability to control our own lives.
For sure. Let's talk about something a little more specific. Cars. The documents really go deep into like how much surveillance is built into modern cars, right? Like one part actually says that, modern cars are a nightmare of surveillance and unauthorized intrusion into privacy. And it basically says that, car owners, they're not even in control anymore. I mean, that's a pretty harsh statement, about what's happening in the car industry.
Yeah, I mean, what's really eye-opening is the details they give, right? Like they talk about how, all these automatic software updates that happen, they're not just adding new features, sometimes they're actually changing how the car works on a really fundamental level. And they're even saying that sometimes these updates could actually like add surveillance mechanisms without, the owner knowing or agreeing to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about it. It's kind of like if your phone updated overnight and instead of just getting like, some new emojis or whatever, it certainly started like tracking your location and sending it back to the company,
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty unsettling. It really makes you think about like, what does ownership even mean anymore when the things we own can be changed remotely? Right?
Yeah.
Without us even knowing what's happening.
Exactly. And then they get into this whole like web of sensors and like telemetry systems, it's like standard in most new cars now. I mean, they're collecting data on everything, like your speed, how you brake, how much gas you're using, even the wear on your tire and more. I mean, it's a lot of information. And to be fair, the document does say that, some of it's for, safety features or, maybe some personalized services that could be useful. But
the big question, right? The ethical and legal question is, are people actually aware of all this data collection? Right? Like, do they really understand what's being collected, how it's being used, and who it's being shared with? I mean, that's the crux of it. And the document really pushes this idea that people need to have control, right? Like they need to be able to say no, to opt out to certain types of data collection, to really be in control of their own digital footprint. Like we need to have the power to decide what happens to our information.
Right. And, they point out that even though we have GDPR in Europe, which is supposed to protect our data, there are still like these gaps, When it comes to cars, it's not always clear who's responsible, especially with all these third-party apps, like the navigation apps and all the entertainment systems that connect to the internet. There's a lot of gray area there, and they highlight that as a real problem.
Yeah, and that's where this proposed law, the e-ZVDZ, comes in. It's basically trying to create a legal framework specifically for data protection in the automotive industry in Slovenia. The document saying that, even GDPR, which is a good law, and even the existing Slovenian data protection law, which they call ZVOP2, they're not really equipped to deal with all the complexities of connected cars, because the technology is evolving so quickly and it's a very specific area, so they need something more targeted.
Yeah, and it also mentions that even the guidelines that the Information Commissioner puts out, the IPRS, those are just guidelines, right? They're not actual law. So there's not a lot of legal weight behind them. And then you've got this whole issue of event data recorders, EDRs, which are basically like black boxes in cars, and it's mandatory to have them now. And they're recording all this data, and it raises a whole lot of questions about, who gets to see that data? What can it be used for? Is it being misused? I mean, the document is really painting a picture of like an urgent need for better laws to protect people in this area.
Absolutely. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about this NSDE, the National Independent Expert Council for Digital Ethics, right? It's quite a mouthful. But the documents you gave us, they shed some light on where it came from and what it's supposed to be doing. It looks like it was created by, it was established by an organization called the Society for Happy Living Bellis, which is an interesting name, but
right. And we actually have the documents, like the annex to the statute of the Society for Happy Living Bellis and the Act on the Establishment of the Independent Expert Council for Digital Ethics, NSDE. And they basically lay out, the structure of it, the principles of how it's supposed to operate,
What's really interesting to me is their whole purpose, right? Their mission statement is to basically be like this expert advisory and oversight body. And their main focus is protecting users in the digital world.
Yeah.
Making sure people are safe and that things are being done ethically. And their mandate seems pretty broad. Like they deal with stuff like, algorithmic bias, making sure everyone has access to digital services, and even like understanding how artificial intelligence is going to impact society, which is a huge question. It's like they're trying to be like the ethical compass, the watchdog for this whole digital age.
Yeah, and they have a lot of responsibility. They're supposed to be coming up with recommendations like best practices, for the digital world. They're also trying to like get people talking about these ethical issues, make the public aware of what's going on. And then they also have this responsibility to actually monitor things, see if there are any like illegal or harmful practices happening. And they even have the power to, take legal action, like that they can initiate misdemeanor proceedings in certain cases. So they have a lot of power to like actually try to enforce ethical behavior.
Yeah, for sure. And the documents even talk about how they operate, right? They have all these different internal bodies, and, which is kind of interesting is that they can have virtual meetings now. So, they can all get together online, which makes sense. And then when it comes to decision making, it's usually based on majority vote, and they try to be as transparent as possible. So they make their votes public, which I think is a good sign, right? It shows they're trying to be accountable. And they also have a president of the council who's kind of like the leader, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Right. The documents emphasize over and over again how important it is for the NSDE to be independent, so they can't be influenced by any outside forces, and that their members have to be really professional and take their job seriously. And they're totally focused on, protecting privacy and personal data, which is, really important these days. They even have a whole ethical code of conduct for all the members. It talks about principles like, they have to be independent in their thinking. They need to have expertise in these areas. They have to be responsible for their actions. They have to be impartial, not biased towards anyone. And of course, they have to put privacy first. It's pretty impressive, It really seems like Slovenia is putting a lot of effort into creating this ethical framework for the digital world.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see. And this kind of leads us right into the e-ZVDZ, which seems like a really big part of, actually addressing all of these concerns we've been talking about. The documents really highlight a lot of different provisions in the law, and they're all aimed at like making sure people's rights are protected and that their data is safe, especially when it comes to all these connected services and smart devices, everything from like you know, smart homes to all these Internet of Things devices, which are, I mean, they're everywhere now. You know?
Yeah, for sure. It's wild how connected everything is these days. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty, what are some of the specific things they're proposing in this law? And one thing that really stood out to me was how much they emphasize consent, like explicit consent. They're basically saying that companies can't just collect data on people's behavior without getting their permission first. And that would be a huge shift, It would really give individuals a lot more control over their information, which is something that I think a lot of people feel like they've lost.
Absolutely. And they're not just stopping there, right? They're also proposing to create a whole new government body, like a National Inspectorate for Automotive Data Protection. They're calling it DIAV. And their whole job would be to audit car manufacturers, to go in and make sure that they're actually handling data properly and following the rules, which, with all the stuff we talked about earlier, that seems like a really important step. And on top of that, they're saying that any car that collects data needs to get certified, like before it can even be sold, which is kind of like a safety check, to make sure that they're building in privacy from the start.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, like kind of like a pre-approval process for data collection. And another thing that I thought was really important, they're saying no more recording license plates without a good reason. Like, if there's no legal basis for it, if it's not related to like, a specific crime or something, they can't just record everyone's movements, which, with all this talk about surveillance, that seems like a really important safeguard.
For sure. And when it comes to third parties, all those companies that want access to your data, the e-ZVDZ is really trying to put some tight restrictions on that,
Yeah.
Like they have to have a really good reason to get access to your data, and they have to handle it very carefully. And they're also really emphasizing people's rights.
Yeah.
Like you have the right to know what data they have on you. You can ask them to correct it if it's wrong, and you can even ask them to delete it entirely. So they're really trying to put people back in control, which is something that's been missing for a long time.
Totally. And it's not just about giving people rights, It's also about making sure companies are being transparent. The law says that if a company changes how they handle your data, they have to tell you about it, which, it sounds simple, but it's a really important step towards building trust, right? Like, people need to be kept in the loop about what's happening with their information.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea of like privacy by design, which means like building privacy protections into technology from the very beginning. That's a big part of the e-ZVDZ. And also this idea of data minimization, right? Which basically means only collect the data you absolutely need. Don't just hoover up everything you can get your hands on, And they're even thinking about like really specific areas like digital medicine, which is obviously very sensitive, They're talking about how important it is to protect people's privacy in healthcare, like using anonymization and encryption to keep data safe and making sure that patients are really informed and they give their consent before any of their data is used.
Yeah, that's a really important area for sure. And, it sounds like they're not messing around with enforcement either. Like they're talking about some pretty hefty fines for companies that break the rules, And in some cases, if they find out that a company has intentionally misused data, they could even face jail time, which is, that sends a pretty strong message, right? Like they're taking this seriously.
Yeah, no kidding. And to make sure that people can actually exercise their rights, the e-ZVDZ is also setting up a system where people can complain to the authorities if they feel like their data has been misused, And if they're not happy with the outcome, they can even go to court to get justice. And just to make sure everything is fair and transparent, they're requiring companies to write their privacy policies in plain language, so that everyone can understand them. And they have to make it really easy for people to find information about how their data is being used. It's like they're trying to cover all the bases here, you know, to make sure that people are really protected.
It really does seem like they're trying to create a really comprehensive law, you know? It's not just focused on cars, it's looking at smart homes too, and all the devices that are connected to the internet, you know?
Yeah.
The Internet of Things, which, I mean, it's basically everything these days. And that's smart because, you know, data privacy is an issue everywhere, right? It's not just about one specific industry or technology.
Right. Exactly. And it even gets into how algorithms should be used, which is a whole other can of worms, you know. But they're basically saying that, you know, companies need to be transparent about how their algorithms work. And if an algorithm makes a decision that impacts you, you have the right to know why, you know, to get an explanation. And they're also saying no to biased algorithms, you know, like the algorithms can't discriminate against people, which is something that, you know, we've seen happening in some cases. So it's good that they're addressing that.
Yeah, algorithms are super powerful these days, so it's really important to make sure they're being used fairly. There's this one part that I thought was really interesting. It says that the lawmakers themselves, you know, the people who are writing the laws, they have a personal responsibility to make sure that the laws are legal, you know, which, I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but, you know, it's good that they're actually putting that into the law, you know?
Yeah.
Like they're holding themselves accountable.
Yeah, it's like a reminder, you know, that everyone's got to follow the rules. And at the end of the day, the e-ZVDZ is really trying to make it clear that human rights are more important than technology, right? Like technology should serve people, not the other way around. And they're putting some pretty strict limits on surveillance. You know, they're saying that you can't just spy on people without a really good reason, and you need to get their consent, and you have to have like scientific proof to back up your actions. You know, it's not just like whatever the government decides, you know. There have to be checks and balances, and they're also pushing for data localization, you know, like keeping data within the European Union, which is interesting.
It's definitely a different approach, you know, and it kind of brings us back to the beginning, you know, to your initial reaction. You know, you were really surprised by all of this. You felt like there were some serious problems, you know, maybe even systemic illegality, you know, in how things are being run in Slovenia. So after looking at all of this, you know, all these documents and all these proposed changes, what do you think? What do you think is at the root of that feeling?
I mean, if you kind of connect the dots, right, it does seem like there's this big gap between how things are being done now, you know, all this data collection, the lack of transparency, the feeling that people don't have control. And then you have this e-ZVDZ, right? Which is trying to lay down these really strong rules and ethical standards. And, you know, it's all supposed to be in line with GDPR and the Slovenian Constitution. And I think that disconnect, you know, between what's happening on the ground and what the law says, that's where that feeling of, you know, something's not right, something's illegal, that's where that comes from, you know. Like the fact that they need to create a whole new law suggests that maybe things haven't been done properly in the past.
Yeah, and we're not here to say definitively, you know, whether or not the state is illegal. Our job is to look at the information, you know, the concerns, the solutions, and present them to you. But one thing is clear, you know, after looking at all these documents, they're really focused on the rule of law, you know, on protecting people's fundamental rights, especially their right to privacy. And they really want things to be more transparent, you know, more accountable. So it's clear that, at least for the people who wrote these documents, these issues are really important.
Yeah, and I think what you're feeling, you know, that surprise, it's not unique. It's something that a lot of people are grappling with, right? It's this tension between like all this amazing technology that's emerging and our basic rights and freedoms. You know, how do we make sure that technology doesn't erode those freedoms, you know? That it actually enhances our lives, you know, And the fact that Slovenia is trying to create this new law, the e-ZVDZ, and they've set up this independent council, the NSDE, I think that shows that they're taking this seriously. They're trying to find ways to protect people in this new digital landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into, all these really interesting Slovenian documents, we've talked about a lot,
Yeah.
We've talked about the concerns around digital surveillance, especially with cars, and then this whole movement to create these really robust data protection laws like the e-ZVDZ and the role of this independent ethics council, the NSDE, making sure things are done the right way.
It's a lot to take in, right? But it all leads to this really fundamental question, right? Like, how can a state operate ethically and legally in this, increasingly digital world, where data is everywhere and everything's connected, and it's a big challenge, right? And it's not just up to governments, Each person has a role to play too, like understanding your rights, protecting your data, and speaking up when you see something that's not right. And these documents, they really bring all of that to the forefront.
For sure. And, we always encourage people to keep learning, to keep digging into these issues, maybe do some research on your own, see what's happening with the e-ZVDZ. Is it going to become law? And what is the NSDE up to? What kind of work are they doing?
Yeah.
It's an ongoing conversation, right? And it's a really important one. So keep asking questions and stay informed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really interesting discussion.